It was a quiet morning in Crestwood, a small suburban town that seemed untouched by the chaos of the world beyond. The sun had barely begun to rise when the lifeless body of Gloria Westbrook was discovered. Her daughter-in-law, Eva, had arrived early, as she did most mornings, to check on her mother-in-law, only to find her lying still in bed, her face expressionless, yet somehow peaceful. For a moment, Eva thought Gloria had simply passed away in her sleep, as many elderly people do. But something was off. There was a certain stillness in the room, a weight in the air that made Eva's stomach twist uncomfortably. She walked closer, her heart sinking as she gently touched Gloria's cold skin. The usual warmth that filled Gloria's home was absent. It was as if the very life force had drained out of the house with her. "Gloria?" Eva whispered, shaking her. No response. Eva's hand trembled as she reached for the phone, dialing the emergency services with shaking fingers. I think she's gone," Eva murmured to the operator, her voice barely a whisper. The authorities arrived soon after, but it was clear that there were no signs of foul play, no marks, no bruises, no indication that anyone had harmed her. The coroner's report confirmed what everyone had suspected: Gloria Westbrook, 58, had passed away in her sleep. The cause was determined to be natural, possibly a heart attack, something that could strike anyone without warning. The town mourned, and the Westbrook family, though saddened, accepted the loss with a quiet grace. But there were whispers in the air, though no one dared speak them aloud. Gloria's death seemed too convenient. The Westbrook family had always appeared to be the picture of perfection, loving, close-knit, an ideal that everyone envied. And yet, beneath the surface, something dark simmered. Detective Rachel Foster, who had recently joined the Crestwood police force, couldn't shake the feeling that something about Gloria's death wasn't right. There was no evidence of violence, but she knew from experience that sometimes, the most disturbing secrets were the hardest to uncover. Her instincts were sharp, and they told her that this wasn't as simple as it seemed. She began her investigation quietly, taking notes, speaking to those closest to Gloria. It wasn't long before Rachel discovered an interesting pattern. Gloria had been isolated in the months leading up to her death. Eva, her daughter-in-law, had become her constant companion. The two women were inseparable, almost to the point of obsession. But Rachel couldn't find any direct evidence linking Eva to anything suspicious, yet something gnawed at her. As the days passed, Rachel's suspicion grew, but she had no concrete proof to go on. Gloria's death appeared to be natural, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. Every detail, every look, every word from Eva seemed to hide something just out of reach. And so, as the town moved forward, burying its secrets along with Gloria, Rachel Foster began her quiet, determined search for the truth, unsure of where it would lead, but certain of one thing: this case was far from over. The Westbrook family had always been the epitome of suburban tranquility. To the outside world, they seemed like the perfect family, successful, well-mannered, and adored by all who knew them. Samuel and Gloria Westbrook had been married for over 30 years, building a life rooted in tradition, respect, and family values. Together, they had raised 2 children, Lucas, their only son, and a daughter who had moved away years ago. Now, with Samuel's death and Lucas and his wife Eva living just a few streets away, Gloria's home had become a place of quiet solitude, with Eva visiting daily to keep her company. Eva had always been close to her mother-in-law. From the moment she had married Lucas, she felt an almost immediate bond with Gloria, a connection that many people would call unusual between a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Eva had always found comfort in Gloria's presence. While Lucas was often absorbed in his work, Gloria was there, offering wisdom, compassion, and the kind of stability that Eva craved. When Samuel died suddenly, it left a void in Gloria's life, and Eva, sensing the growing sadness in her mother-in-law, became more involved, more present than ever. The relationship between the two women, however, was starting to take on a new dimension, one that Eva could no longer ignore, though she didn't fully understand it. It began innocently, as many things do, with simple gestures of comfort, an extra hug, a hand on the shoulder, a moment of understanding during quiet afternoons. But as the weeks passed, their interactions became more intense, more emotionally charged. Eva found herself spending more time at Gloria's house, offering support during lonely nights, keeping her company as the world outside grew colder and darker. They would sit by the fire, sipping wine, talking about their lives, their hopes, and their fears. Gloria often spoke about her late husband, Samuel, and how much she missed him, how difficult it was to live without him. It was during one of these evenings that something shifted. Eva hadn't meant for it to happen. She was simply comforting Gloria, who had become increasingly vulnerable in the wake of Samuel's death. But when their hands brushed during a moment of shared grief, it felt like an unspoken connection had been forged between them. Gloria's touch lingered, and Eva felt a flutter in her chest, an unfamiliar sensation, something that made her stomach tighten. It wasn't just grief anymore. There was something deeper, something more visceral that had begun to emerge. At first, Eva pulled away, confused and unsettled by the unexpected wave of emotion that surged within her. But Gloria's eyes, filled with longing and a sadness too deep for words, drew her back. That night, what had begun as a moment of shared comfort between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law evolved into something much more complex. They kissed, hesitantly at first, then with a desperation neither could explain. For Eva, it was as if the weight of the years of pent-up loneliness, of longing for affection that she had never fully received from Lucas, had burst free in that one, stolen moment. Gloria's kiss was tender, and yet there was an undeniable hunger in it, a need that had been buried beneath layers of grief and loss. The next day, both women were awkward and quiet, avoiding each other's gaze, but the damage had been done. Neither could pretend that the event hadn't happened, nor could they ignore the pull that existed between them. The lines between daughter-in-law and mother-in-law had blurred. The intimacy they shared in that moment, though taboo, had ignited something neither was prepared for, something neither knew how to stop. Eva's guilt weighed on her, but at the same time, there was an undeniable attraction she couldn't shake. The dynamic between her and Gloria had changed. What began as a simple desire to comfort had quickly escalated into something far more dangerous, far more complicated. Eva knew it was wrong, knew it could destroy everything, but the pull she felt toward Gloria was undeniable, like a magnetic force that she couldn't resist. Lucas, oblivious to the storm brewing between his wife and his mother, noticed a change in Eva, but he couldn't pinpoint what was wrong. She seemed distracted, distant at times, more tired than usual. He tried to talk to her about it, to ask if everything was okay, but Eva always brushed him off with vague reassurances. Deep down, though, he could sense that something had shifted. He just didn't know what it was. Gloria, for her part, was becoming more possessive of Eva. The bond between them was no longer one of simply offering solace, it had turned into something desperate. Gloria began to demand Eva's time, needing her constant presence. She would call her multiple times a day, even when Eva was with Lucas. If Eva so much as mentioned spending time with anyone else, especially Lucas, Gloria became irrationally jealous, her eyes hardening with fear. The love and obsession that had once been born from shared grief had now morphed into something darker, more consuming. Eva began to feel trapped. She was caught between the love she felt for her husband, her duty as a wife, and the emotional chaos Gloria had unleashed in her. The guilt weighed heavily on her, but so did the need to be with Gloria. Eva had no idea how to extricate herself from the situation. She had never wanted this, but now she was in too deep. Each encounter with Gloria only seemed to deepen the complexity of their bond, pulling her further away from the life she had once known with Lucas. The weight of their secret became too much for Eva to carry, yet she found herself returning again and again. Gloria, though older and grieving, had a vitality that Eva couldn't ignore. The attraction was undeniable, and as much as Eva tried to fight it, she couldn't break free. The more she tried to distance herself, the tighter Gloria's grip became. The dynamic in the Westbrook household had shifted. No longer was it a safe haven for Eva, it had become a prison. A prison built on forbidden desire, guilt, and secrecy. And as the days passed, the walls began to close in on Eva, each encounter with Gloria pulling her deeper into a web she didn't know how to escape. Lucas had no idea what was happening behind closed doors, and that was the most terrifying part of all. Little did he know, the woman he had loved, the woman who had been his partner for years, was slowly unraveling in the most unimaginable way. The Westbrook family, once a picture of stability, was now teetering on the edge of destruction. And no one, not even Rachel Foster, could have predicted how far the lies would go, or how much damage would be done before the truth was finally revealed. Eva's life had become a blur, a constant tension between guilt and desire, between what was right and what felt so undeniably intoxicating. After that night, after the kiss, the boundaries between herself and Gloria had been permanently erased. What had started as a moment of compassion in the wake of grief had now spiraled into something neither of them could control. It was easy at first to brush it off, to convince herself that it was just a one-time mistake. Eva tried to pretend that nothing had changed between her and Gloria. But when they met again, it was impossible to ignore the tension in the room. Gloria, ever the master of subtlety, greeted Eva with a smile that was at once comforting and knowing, as if she were silently daring her to admit what had passed between them. Eva's pulse quickened every time she saw Gloria now, and it wasn't just out of affection. It was a pull, an overwhelming attraction that refused to be denied. The days following that kiss were filled with quiet unease. Eva would wake up with a knot in her stomach, knowing that she would have to face Gloria again. And yet, when she arrived at Gloria's house, there was a strange comfort in their shared silences, the way their glances seemed to speak volumes that words could not. Every time Eva looked at Gloria, she saw more than the woman who had once been her mother-in-law, she saw someone who, in that moment, understood her in ways no one else did. It wasn't just the physical connection, it was an emotional one, too. Gloria's vulnerability, her grief, her loneliness, Eva couldn't help but feel drawn to it. But that wasn't all. Gloria began to push harder, to demand more from Eva. It wasn't just the need for comfort anymore. It was something darker, more insistent. Gloria began to touch her more, hold her hand a little longer, brush against her body in ways that were unmistakable. It was clear that Gloria wanted this, wanted Eva in a way that transcended family, transcended everything. And Eva, though conflicted and terrified by the implications, couldn't pull herself away. Eva tried to tell herself that it was just a way for both of them to cope with their grief. She convinced herself that the kiss had been a fleeting lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness. She tried to focus on her marriage to Lucas, to her role as a wife, but she couldn't deny the growing attraction she felt toward Gloria. Every time she saw her, every touch, every word, only seemed to pull her deeper into the tangled mess they had created. The lines between right and wrong became more blurred with every encounter. The emotional and physical pull was too strong to ignore, and soon Eva found herself giving in. It wasn't just about the physical connection. There was a bond growing between them, one that Eva couldn't explain but couldn't escape. Gloria's emotional neediness, her desperate longing for affection, began to feed into Eva's own insecurities. Eva had always felt somewhat neglected by Lucas. His long hours at work, his detachment, his inability to truly understand her, these were things she had learned to live with. But Gloria saw her. Gloria understood her. In those moments, she made Eva feel alive in a way that Lucas never had. She made Eva feel needed, wanted, seen. And that's what scared her the most. Eva knew this was wrong. She knew it was an affair, something that should never have happened. But every time she thought about stepping away, every time she tried to make sense of her feelings, she was pulled back into the web Gloria had spun. The guilt gnawed at her constantly, making it harder to breathe. She loved Lucas, didn't she? He was her husband, the father of her children. He had stood by her through thick and thin. But now, with every stolen kiss, with every secret rendezvous with Gloria, she felt like she was betraying him in ways she couldn't even begin to describe. The worst part was that Eva couldn't find the strength to stop. She knew it was destroying her family, tearing apart the very foundation of everything she had worked so hard to build, but she couldn't bring herself to end it. She was trapped. Gloria had wrapped her in a complicated web of affection, guilt, and need that she didn't know how to escape from. The emotional weight of it all was suffocating, but at the same time, it felt like the only thing that made sense anymore. Every day, as the weeks went by, Eva's internal conflict deepened. She would spend hours lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what she had become. What had happened to the woman who had vowed to love Lucas, to honor their vows? Had that woman been consumed by the secret she was keeping, by the passion she had found in the arms of someone she was never supposed to love? Could she go back to her old life once this was over, if it ever ended? But the real problem was this: Eva didn't want it to end. She didn't know how to stop herself. She was caught between two worlds, between the love she once had for her husband and the overwhelming pull she felt toward Gloria. In her heart, Eva knew that this affair, this forbidden, twisted love, was only the beginning of a spiral that could destroy everything she had. But in her mind, the pull of desire and the complex emotional bond she had developed with Gloria kept her trapped, unable to break free. Lucas had started to notice the distance growing between them, but he couldn't understand why. Eva was quieter, more distant. She was still there physically, but emotionally, she seemed unreachable. She was constantly on edge, always preoccupied, always looking over her shoulder as if she feared someone would catch her. But Eva couldn't explain it to him, not without revealing the truth, a truth that could destroy not only her marriage but her entire life. Every interaction with Gloria felt like a tightrope walk. One wrong move, and the whole fragile facade would come crashing down. But Eva didn't care. The forbidden nature of their relationship, the danger it posed, only made it more exciting, more impossible to resist. And so, she continued. The lies, the guilt, the desire, each day they grew stronger, weaving together into a tangled mess that Eva no longer knew how to untangle. Eva had crossed a line, and now, with every touch, every kiss, she was walking further away from the life she had once known, heading into uncharted territory where love, betrayal, and guilt collided. Eva's life had become a tightrope walk, one misstep away from disaster. Each visit to Gloria's house felt like a betrayal, but it also felt like the only thing that kept her breathing. The line between comfort and sin had blurred so much that she no longer knew where one began and the other ended. What started as a simple act of emotional support had grown into a dangerous, uncontrollable cycle, one that neither woman seemed willing to break free from. Gloria's presence had become a drug for Eva. It wasn't just the stolen kisses or the whispered confessions in the quiet hours of the night, it was the way Gloria looked at her, the way her touch lingered a second too long, the way she needed her. Eva had never experienced anything like it before. Gloria was no longer just the mother of her husband. She was her lover, her confidant, and in some twisted way, her only escape. But every time their hands brushed, every time Gloria kissed her, a voice in Eva's head screamed in protest. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was wrong. Yet she couldn't stop herself. Every time Eva left Gloria's house, her chest would tighten with guilt. The weight of what they had done hung heavily around her neck. She would return home to Lucas, pretending that nothing had changed, pretending that everything was as it should be. But she couldn't escape the truth, not when it was so ingrained in her every thought, her every action. Her heart raced every time she kissed Lucas goodnight, knowing that it wasn't the only kiss she had shared that day. The thought of his warm embrace made her sick with guilt, yet there was no way to stop herself from returning to Gloria. It was a need she couldn't control. The affair wasn't just physical anymore. It was emotional, psychological, and inescapable. The more Eva tried to pull away, the tighter the hold Gloria had on her became. It wasn't just the stolen moments of affection, it was the constant reassurance Gloria needed. Every time Eva tried to retreat, Gloria would demand more. She would call, text, show up at her door, needing her to stay, to love her, to be there for her in ways that Eva couldn't explain. Gloria was possessive, more than Eva had ever anticipated. The more she tried to maintain the fragile balance between her family and her secret, the more she realized that Gloria was suffocating her. Eva became a prisoner to Gloria's needs. She began lying more frequently to Lucas, making excuses for why she couldn't be home or why she needed to leave early. She would tell him she was running errands, visiting friends, or working late. The lies came so easily, so naturally, that Eva no longer recognized the woman she was becoming. It wasn't just the affair that weighed on her conscience, it was the constant deception, the tangled web of lies she had created to cover up her actions. She had stopped being honest with Lucas long ago, and it was starting to take its toll. Lucas had begun to notice the distance growing between them. At first, he dismissed it as a result of stress at work or the pressure of their busy lives. But soon, he saw the cracks in their relationship. Eva was no longer the attentive wife she once was. She was distant, distracted, and often lost in her thoughts. When they were together, there was an uncomfortable silence between them, as if something was lurking just beneath the surface. And every time he tried to talk to her about it, Eva would brush him off, telling him she was fine, that everything was okay. But it was becoming clear that it wasn't. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, Lucas confronted Eva. "Is something going on?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "You've been distant. You're not yourself lately. What's happening, Eva?" Eva froze, panic coursing through her veins. She wanted to lie, to tell him everything was fine. But the truth was that it was no longer something she could hide. She had become so entangled in the affair with Gloria that she could no longer look her husband in the eye without feeling sick. She knew that Lucas had a right to know, but she was too terrified of what the truth would do to them, to their family, to their life. So, she did what she had done countless times before, she lied. "I'm just tired, Lucas," she said, her voice shaking with barely contained emotion. "Work has been stressful, and I've been dealing with a lot lately." "It's nothing. Really?" Lucas nodded, though his eyes remained suspicious. He didn't press her further, but Eva knew that the seed of doubt had been planted. It wouldn't be long before he started looking for answers. And when he found them, the consequences would be catastrophic. But even with that knowledge weighing on her, Eva couldn't stop herself. Gloria's pull on her was stronger than ever. They were trapped in a vicious cycle, one that repeated itself over and over. Eva would give in, surrender to the moment, and then feel the crushing guilt afterward. The affair, once an escape from loneliness and isolation, had become a cage of its own. Every secret rendezvous with Gloria only deepened Eva's internal conflict. She was torn between the woman she loved and the man who was still her husband. Each time she returned to Lucas, she couldn't shake the images of Gloria, the softness of her skin, the way her lips felt against hers, the quiet comfort of being held in Gloria's arms. It was all too much to resist. The more Eva gave herself to Gloria, the more trapped she felt. She no longer knew who she was. The woman she used to be, the wife, the mother, was slipping away, replaced by someone she barely recognized. The lies, the guilt, the passion, the shame, each of them wove itself into the fabric of her life, until she was tangled in a web from which she couldn't escape. And the worst part was, she didn't know if she even wanted to. Gloria, too, had become consumed by the affair. The desperation in her eyes was evident, and the possessiveness she exhibited over Eva was growing. The emotional manipulation had started subtly, but now it was obvious. Gloria would do anything to keep Eva close, anything to ensure that their bond remained unbroken. The fear of losing her was almost as powerful as the desire to possess her. Eva had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The affair had morphed into something far more complicated than either woman had anticipated. What began as an escape from loneliness had become a destructive force, slowly unraveling everything in its path. And neither Eva nor Gloria knew how to stop it. The tension in the Westbrook household had reached a breaking point. Eva was no longer the woman Lucas had married. He could feel it in the way she looked at him, distant, evasive. He could see it in the way she pulled away from his touch, the way her mind seemed to drift when they were together. Her smiles had become forced, and the warmth he once felt in her presence was gone, replaced by something cold and distant. Lucas had always trusted Eva implicitly, but lately, a gnawing sense of unease had taken root in him. Something wasn't right, and it was eating at him, like a splinter buried deep beneath his skin. It wasn't just the distance between them that troubled him, it was the way she had begun to act so secretive. She was on her phone more than ever before, texting in hushed tones, looking over her shoulder, always seeming distracted. When he asked her about it, she would brush him off with a forced smile, claiming she was just tired or overwhelmed with work. But Lucas wasn't stupid. He could see the signs. And his gut told him that something was terribly wrong. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where the silence between them was almost suffocating, Lucas decided that he could no longer ignore his suspicions. He had to know the truth. He couldn't go on living in this limbo of doubt, pretending that everything was fine when he knew deep down that it wasn't. But how could he prove it? He couldn't just ask Eva outright. She would deny it, just like she had denied everything else. So, he did what he thought he had to do, he set a trap. Lucas had never been one for secrets or deception, but the thought of losing Eva, of being betrayed by her in such a way, made him desperate. Late one night, after Eva had gone to bed, he quietly installed a hidden camera in their bedroom, tucked away in a discreet corner where it wouldn't be noticed. He knew it was a violation of trust, but the need for answers overpowered everything else. He needed to know the truth, and he needed to know it now. For days, Lucas agonized over his decision. He kept telling himself that it was for the best, that it would bring clarity. But deep down, he felt sick. He was betraying the woman he loved, even if she had already betrayed him in ways he could never have imagined. The guilt gnawed at him, but the possibility of uncovering the truth was too powerful to ignore. The moment he had feared the most came sooner than he expected. One Sunday afternoon, after he had spent the entire day working in his office, Lucas returned to their bedroom to retrieve something from his drawer. As he walked in, his eyes immediately landed on the small device hidden in the corner of the room. He had forgotten about it for a moment, but now, as he recalled what it was, a sick feeling twisted in his gut. He walked over to the computer, opened the footage, and began to watch. At first, the footage was uneventful, just a few moments of Eva walking in and out of the room, sitting on the bed, checking her phone. But then, around the middle of the clip, everything changed. Eva entered the room, followed by Gloria. They stood in the doorway for a moment, exchanging a look that sent a chill down Lucas's spine. He watched in disbelief as his wife and mother moved toward each other, their hands touching. Then, without warning, Gloria pulled Eva into a kiss. Lucas froze. The world seemed to stop spinning. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. His own mother, the woman he had trusted, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. And Eva, his wife, the woman he had spent years building a life with, was kissing her, embracing her, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath caught in his throat. The betrayal felt like a knife in his stomach, twisting with each passing second of the footage. He watched as Gloria and Eva's kiss deepened, as they embraced each other with an intimacy that he had never once shared with either of them. Lucas felt the weight of the moment, the crushing, suffocating weight of his entire life falling apart in front of him. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to steady himself, but the images were seared into his mind. He wanted to scream, to confront them right then and there, but the anger and disbelief were so overwhelming that he couldn't move. He was paralyzed, not by fear, but by the crushing reality that everything he had known was a lie. The footage continued for several minutes, and Lucas could hardly bear to watch. But his eyes were glued to the screen. He saw how they touched, how they whispered to each other, completely unaware of the camera that was recording their every move. The weight of the betrayal was unbearable. He knew that confronting them would be a disaster, but the question now was, how could he confront them? And what would he do when he had the answers he had so desperately sought? Lucas sat in silence, staring at the screen as the camera continued to record. His mind raced with 1,000 questions, but there was only one thing that consumed him now: revenge. The anger that had been building inside him for so long finally boiled over. He felt as though he had been betrayed by everyone, his wife, his mother, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. But one thing was clear: he couldn't let this go. He couldn't just walk away and pretend it didn't happen. The rage that had built inside him had now turned into a plan, a dark, twisted plan. Lucas couldn't control the storm of emotions that were flooding through him, and he wasn't sure he even wanted to anymore. This was no longer about understanding or forgiveness. It was about payback. And payback, he decided, would come in a way that would make them both feel the weight of the lies they had built their lives on. The days that followed were a blur of anger, pain, and deep, seething hatred. Lucas felt as though his entire world had been shattered into jagged pieces that he could never put back together. The moment the camera had revealed the truth, the betrayal of both his wife, Eva, and his own mother, Gloria, something inside him had snapped. The emotional devastation was too much to bear, and with each passing hour, the weight of the knowledge he now carried grew heavier. He had always prided himself on being a reasonable man, a man of integrity. He had built his life with Eva on the foundation of love and trust, a trust that had now been completely shattered. And then there was Gloria, the woman who had raised him, who had shown him love, who he had respected his entire life. Now, she was just as guilty as Eva, a traitor to him in the most unforgivable way. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all, but every thought seemed to lead to the same conclusion: the only way to end this was to rid himself of Gloria once and for all. It wasn't just the affair, it was everything. The years of betrayal, the lies, the manipulations that both Gloria and Eva had so easily woven into his life. He had been blindsided, made a fool of, and now he was trapped in a web of deceit that had no escape. The pain of being discarded by the two people he had loved most was unbearable, and Lucas found himself consumed by thoughts of revenge. He knew what he had to do, but the weight of the decision still hung heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't undo what had already been done. He couldn't take back the betrayal, and no apology from Eva or Gloria would ever make it right. The only thing that seemed to offer any relief, any sense of justice, was to take matters into his own hands. Lucas had never considered violence before, never imagined that he could take the life of another person. But now, as the anger and despair surged through him, he found himself plotting the only way to bring the pain to an end. Gloria had to die. He couldn't live with the image of her and Eva, so intertwined in their treachery, destroying everything he held dear. She had destroyed his marriage, his trust, and his very sense of self-worth. There was no other way out. The idea of killing Gloria wasn't something that came to him suddenly, it had been there, lurking in the back of his mind ever since he saw the footage. But now, it was more than just an idea. It was a plan. A cold, calculated decision that he would carry out. The rage inside him was growing more intense with every thought of her, and he realized that this was the only way to regain control, the only way to make her feel the weight of what she had done to him. He knew that Gloria had a routine, a set of habits that she followed religiously. One of them was her nightly cup of tea. She had always been fond of it, a soothing ritual before bed that helped her sleep. It was the perfect opportunity, the perfect moment for him to strike. Lucas spent the next few days preparing himself, mentally and physically, for what he was about to do. He would make it quick, make it clean. No mess. No mistakes. He couldn't afford to get caught. One evening, after dinner, he watched Gloria prepare her tea as she always did. She moved around the kitchen with her usual grace, humming softly to herself as she boiled water. Lucas stood in the doorway, watching her with cold, calculating eyes. He had made up his mind, and there was no turning back. As she turned to the cupboard to retrieve her tea bags, Lucas slipped into the kitchen, making sure not to make a sound. His heart was pounding in his chest as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial of arsenic, purchased from a hardware store under the guise of needing it for a rat problem in the attic. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, but now that it was happening, everything felt surreal. He poured the poison carefully into the tea, watching the liquid dissolve, knowing that this was the only way to end it all. Gloria returned to the counter, her back turned as she prepared her tea. Lucas stepped behind her, his hands shaking, his stomach churning. He couldn't afford to hesitate. This was his only chance. When she turned to take the cup, he acted quickly, maintaining a calm, neutral expression. "Thank you for keeping me company tonight, Lucas," Gloria said as she smiled, holding the cup up to her lips. "You're welcome," Lucas replied, his voice steady but hollow, his gaze fixed on the cup in her hands. It felt like everything had come to a halt in that moment, as if the world were holding its breath. He watched as Gloria took a sip, her eyes closing slightly as she savored the warmth of the tea. For a few moments, there was nothing, just the silence of the kitchen, the sound of the clock ticking. Then, Gloria set the cup down, wiping her lips with the back of her hand. "Good night, Lucas," she said, turning toward the stairs. Lucas stood there, his heart racing, his breath shallow. He watched her leave the room, and the seconds felt like hours. His body tensed as he waiting for the moment when the poison would take effect. Gloria's footsteps faded as she ascended the stairs to her bedroom, but Lucas remained frozen in place, staring at the cup that had been the instrument of his revenge. An hour passed, and still, there was no sign that the poison had worked. Lucas grew more and more agitated, pacing the room, staring at the clock on the wall. The fear began to creep in. What if it hadn't worked? What if she was still alive? What if she found out what he had done? But then, the stillness of the house was broken by a faint sound, one that made Lucas's stomach drop. It was a soft thud, a faint noise coming from upstairs. He waited, his pulse quickening, until he could hear no more. After what felt like an eternity, he cautiously crept upstairs, his steps silent on the carpeted floor. He opened the door to Gloria's room slowly, and there she was, lying in bed, still and unmoving, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. She was gone. Lucas stood in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. The deed was done. And in that moment, as the truth of his actions settled over him, he realized that there was no going back. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. What he had done to Gloria was final, and now, he had to live with the consequences. The days following Gloria's death were filled with a sense of eerie calm. Lucas had done what he thought was necessary, but the weight of his actions began to settle heavily on his chest. He had crossed a line, one that he could never return from, and no matter how much he tried to pretend otherwise, there was no escaping the consequences. At first, the facade seemed easy to maintain. No one had suspected anything. The police, initially investigating the cause of death, had confirmed that it appeared to be natural. There was no evidence of foul play, just an elderly woman who had passed away in her sleep, perhaps a heart attack or some other sudden medical event. Lucas played the role of the grieving son, doing everything expected of him. He comforted Eva, whom he hadn't yet told the truth, and assured the neighbors and friends who called with their condolences that his mother's death was simply a tragic, though inevitable, part of life. But every moment he spent pretending, every kind word, every tear he shed, felt like a lie. The guilt gnawed at him relentlessly, tugging at the edges of his composure. The house that had once felt like a home now felt like a prison. Every corner held a reminder of the crime he had committed. Every sound, every silence, made him jump. He couldn't escape the weight of Gloria's death, not even in his own mind. Eva, too, was struggling. She was devastated by her mother-in-law's sudden passing, though she didn't yet understand why the grief felt so raw, so suffocating. Lucas could see the confusion in her eyes, could feel the unspoken questions that lingered between them. But Eva never asked, and Lucas never offered any answers. She buried her sorrow, and he buried his truth. The nights were the worst. When they lay in bed together, Eva pressed close to him, seeking solace in his arms. Lucas could hardly breathe. The guilt, the tension, it was suffocating. He felt her warmth beside him, but it was a constant reminder of what had happened, of the lies they were living, of the love he no longer felt. He was there physically, but his mind and heart were elsewhere, consumed by the horror of his actions. It was a delicate balance, keeping up appearances while the darkness of his secret festered beneath the surface. Lucas tried his best to shield Eva from the truth, to pretend that nothing had changed. He held her when she cried for her mother, wiped away her tears, and reassured her that they would get through this together. And in a way, they did, at least outwardly. But inside, he was falling apart. Each passing day brought more guilt, more anxiety, and a constant reminder of the truth he was hiding. The reality of what he had done threatened to consume him whole, but he couldn't face it. Not yet. Eva had no idea that her husband was slowly unraveling. She thought that their life would return to some sense of normalcy after the funeral, that with time, the pain would lessen. She focused on the memories of her mother-in-law, remembering the good times and the love Gloria had shown her, but deep down, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong, something that Lucas was hiding. She couldn't place it, couldn't understand what had shifted, but she could sense the growing distance between them. Lucas had changed, but she didn't know how or why. It was around this time that the subtle shifts in Lucas's behavior began to show more clearly. He was irritable, quick to anger, and more withdrawn than ever. He had always been a patient man, but now he snapped at Eva over small things, things that didn't matter. He was distracted, absent, as though he was living in a world of his own, one that she couldn't reach. The anger that had once been a fleeting moment of fury was now a constant presence in his life. It was as though everything had become a trigger, a reminder of what he had done, of the woman he had killed. One evening, as Lucas sat in his office, staring at the cold, empty walls of his home, he found himself reliving the moment over and over in his mind. The sound of Gloria's breath slowing, her lifeless body as he had left it in her room, her final, peaceful sleep. He had thought it would bring him peace, that eliminating the source of his torment would somehow restore order to his life. But instead, all it had done was open a chasm of emptiness inside him that he couldn't fill. Every time Eva reached out to him, he felt disgusted with himself. How could he look her in the eye? How could he continue pretending that everything was fine when he knew what he had done? The guilt was overwhelming, and it seemed to have no end. Yet, every day, he played the part of the devoted husband, the grieving son. He went through the motions, arranging dinner, helping with the house, smiling at their neighbors. But none of it felt real. It was all a mask, a performance to keep the world from seeing the truth. The emotional toll of keeping up the charade was taking its toll on Lucas's mental health. He found himself drinking more, staying up later, trying to numb the pain that constantly gnawed at him. He wasn't sure what he was trying to escape from, the horror of his crime, or the guilt of hiding it from the one person he swore to love and protect. Every drink, every sleepless night, only made it harder to face the truth. Meanwhile, Eva continued to grieve. She missed Gloria, missed her wisdom, her presence, her unconditional love. But as the days passed, the nagging doubts in her mind grew. She had no evidence, no concrete reason to suspect Lucas, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man she had married was different. He was distant, detached. And though he held her when she cried, she could feel that he wasn't really there. It was as if the man she had once known had died, too. Lucas wasn't just hiding a murder. He was hiding his very self, burying the man he used to be under layers of guilt, denial, and lies. He didn't know how much longer he could keep up the act. But for now, he had no choice. As Eva went to bed each night, still grieving for her mother-in-law, she had no idea that the man she had trusted the most had already buried her in a way far worse than death itself. And as Lucas lay beside her, pretending to be the husband she needed, he was dying on the inside, trapped in a web of lies he had spun himself. Detective Rachel Foster had always trusted her instincts. It was the reason she was a detective, the reason she could sense when something was amiss, even in the most straightforward cases. And as she reviewed the report on Gloria Westbrook's death, a nagging feeling began to form in her mind. The initial findings, though pointing to a natural death, just didn't sit right with her. There was something about the way everything had fallen into place so smoothly, too smoothly, that made her suspicious. Gloria Westbrook, a 58-year-old woman in relatively good health, had passed away in her sleep, the doctors said. Her heart had simply given out. There was no sign of struggle, no outward injury. It seemed like a clean case, something easy to write off. Yet, Rachel couldn't ignore the questions that lingered in the back of her mind. Why did she feel so unsettled? Why had Gloria's sudden death hit the community so hard, even though she hadn't been particularly ill? It didn't make sense, and Rachel was determined to find out why. Rachel's gut told her there was more to the story. So, she did what she always did when she had doubts, she dug deeper. She began by looking into Gloria's medical history, and what she found only fueled her suspicions. There were no signs of heart disease or any major health concerns that could have led to an early death. Gloria had visited her doctor regularly, and by all accounts, she was in good health for her age. This wasn't a woman who should have died in her sleep of a heart attack. Something about this felt off, and Rachel wasn't going to let it go. The next step in her investigation was to speak with the people closest to Gloria, her family. Lucas and Eva were naturally her first suspects. Eva, the daughter-in-law, had been especially close to Gloria, spending a lot of time with her after the death of Gloria's husband. Rachel began with Eva. She was calm, almost too calm, when Rachel questioned her about the death. Eva told her the usual things, the suddenness of it all, how shocking it had been, and how she had always considered Gloria like a second mother. But Rachel wasn't buying it. There was a certain distance in Eva's eyes, an uneasiness in her demeanor that made Rachel pause. She then moved on to Lucas. He, too, seemed unfazed by his mother's death, almost disturbingly so. As Rachel pressed him for details, she noticed his rehearsed responses and the way he avoided eye contact. It wasn't that Lucas seemed guilty, but his behavior felt strange. It was like he was hiding something, or worse, pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Rachel made a note to dig into their backgrounds more thoroughly. She could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to shift, but she needed more evidence to connect the dots. The breakthrough came when Rachel took a closer look at the house itself. Gloria's home had been left undisturbed after her death, and Rachel had the feeling that there might be something hidden, some clue that would reveal the truth. She went over the house with a fine-toothed comb, paying special attention to Gloria's personal belongings, her medicine cabinet, and her routine. That's when she found it, a hidden camera system, tucked away in a back corner of the living room. It seemed innocent enough at first, perhaps Gloria had just been concerned about security, Rachel thought. But as she examined the footage, her heart sank. The cameras had captured more than just intruders. They had captured the secret affair between Eva and Gloria. The camera footage was a series of clips that showed Eva and Gloria in moments of intimacy, moments that made Rachel's stomach churn as she watched them. There was no denying it. They had been involved in a secret, forbidden relationship, one that had remained hidden from everyone, including Lucas. The tapes revealed the truth: Eva and Gloria had shared more than just the comfort of one another's company. Their relationship was intense, passionate, and incredibly secretive. There were heated arguments, followed by passionate reconciliations, and then, more. Rachel watched in disbelief as the two women's relationship unfolded on the screen. Each clip added weight to the growing suspicion that there was more to Gloria's death than just natural causes. The more Rachel watched, the more she realized that the affair had placed an unbearable strain on Eva. She was clearly conflicted, torn between her love for Gloria and her loyalty to her husband. Rachel knew that the affair was significant, but it wasn't enough to explain Gloria's death. Eva, though emotionally distressed, hadn't seemed to be the type to commit murder. Yet, as Rachel watched more footage, something else began to take shape: Gloria's growing possessiveness of Eva. The footage was filled with moments where Gloria seemed to demand more of Eva's time, more of her attention. She grew irrationally jealous when Eva mentioned spending time with anyone else. It was clear that Gloria had begun to manipulate Eva emotionally, using her own feelings of guilt and desire to keep her close. But it wasn't just emotional manipulation, it was the subtle, controlling behavior that Rachel recognized all too well. Gloria was using her power over Eva, and it was starting to become toxic. The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place when Rachel discovered the receipt, a small, innocuous purchase at a local hardware store just days before Gloria's death. It was for arsenic, the same poison that could have easily slipped into Gloria's tea. Rachel had her answer. It was no accident. Gloria had been poisoned. The question now was who had done it, and why. As the pieces fell into place, Rachel was sure of one thing: Lucas was involved. But what had driven him to kill his own mother? What had pushed him to take such a drastic step to end the affair and silence the woman who had betrayed him? The answers lay just ahead, and Rachel was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. The truth had been uncovered, but the consequences were far from over. The quiet town of Crestwood, which had once been so peaceful and serene, was now the backdrop for a tragedy that no one could have anticipated. The investigation had spiraled into a nightmare for the Westbrook family, one that would shatter everything they had known. The affair between Eva and Gloria, the poisoning, and the web of lies and betrayal that had enveloped them all, none of it could be undone. The damage was done, and there was no way out. As the evidence mounted, Rachel was able to piece together the full story. Lucas, after discovering his wife's affair with his mother, had been consumed by rage and betrayal. His feelings of abandonment and humiliation had driven him to a dark place, a place where logic and morality no longer held sway. He had carefully planned Gloria's death, using arsenic to make it look like a natural death. But what he hadn't anticipated was how everything would unravel after that night. The guilt, the weight of his actions, and the consequences of what he had done began to suffocate him in ways he couldn't have foreseen. The courtroom became the stage for the final reckoning. The prosecution laid out its case methodically, presenting the hidden camera footage that revealed the affair between Eva and Gloria, the poison that had killed Gloria, and the motive that Lucas had when he felt his world had been destroyed. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Lucas had been driven to madness by the betrayal, that his actions were fueled by the anguish of a broken heart. But it was clear to the jury that his actions had been premeditated, that he had crossed a line from emotional pain to cold-blooded murder. Lucas sat in the courtroom, his face a mask of stoic indifference, but anyone who looked closely could see the cracks. His once composed demeanor had faltered. The anger and pain that had driven him to kill his own mother were still evident in the way he held himself, in the slight tremor of his hands. He had thought that killing Gloria would bring him peace, that it would somehow right the wrongs he had felt had been done to him. But now, sitting there in the courtroom, he realized how hollow that belief had been. He hadn't gained control. He hadn't regained his dignity. He had lost everything: his family, his wife, his mother, his own soul. Eva, too, was consumed by the aftermath. She sat quietly in the courtroom, her face pale and drained of all emotion. She had lost her mother-in-law and now, seemingly, her marriage. The affair that had once seemed like an escape had led to her own undoing. The guilt and shame were overwhelming. She had betrayed Lucas, yes, but she had also betrayed herself. She had let herself fall into something that destroyed the very core of who she was. Now, the truth was out, and there was no way to hide from it. As the trial concluded and the jury deliberated, Eva's heart broke for what could have been, for the family she had once hoped to build with Lucas. She realized, too late, that the relationship with Gloria had been an illusion, a fleeting moment of solace that was built on lies and secrecy. Her own desperation for affection had led her down a path that she couldn't take back. And now, everything she had known and loved was gone. The verdict was swift. Lucas was found guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the sentence. No one could speak for the pain that had been caused, for the lives that had been irrevocably changed. Lucas would pay for his crime, but the cost was much higher than anyone had anticipated. He had not only killed his mother but also destroyed the life he had once taken for granted. After the trial, Eva left Crestwood. She couldn't stay in the town where the ghosts of her mistakes haunted every corner. She packed up her belongings, took her children, and moved far away from the place that had once been her home. She hoped, though she didn't believe it, that starting over would bring her peace. But in her heart, she knew there was no true escape. The shame of what she had done, the regret, would follow her wherever she went. She would never be able to undo the choices she had made, and the damage to her family was irreparable. As for Rachel Foster, the detective who had uncovered the truth, she couldn't help but reflect on the lesson in all of this. She had seen so many tragedies in her career, but this case felt different. It wasn't just about murder, it was about the destruction of a family, the consequences of betrayal, and the devastation that secrets could bring. There was a lesson in this story that, though painful, was necessary. When love is tainted by lies, when trust is shattered by betrayal, the fallout is catastrophic. What had begun as a search for truth had led to the unraveling of everything. And in the end, there was no winner. There was only loss. Rachel sat at her desk, looking over the case files one last time, knowing that nothing would ever be the same for the Westbrook family again. The human cost of their choices had been far greater than any of them could have imagined. The quiet town of Crestwood, once an idyllic picture of suburban bliss, was now forever marked by the tragedy of the Westbrook family. The ripples of betrayal, revenge, and guilt had left scars that could never be erased. For Lucas, Eva, and even Gloria, their choices had led to an irreversible fate, one filled with consequences too heavy to bear. But the echoes of their actions would continue to haunt not just them, but everyone who had been caught in their web of lies. Lucas spent the rest of his life behind bars, his once promising future now reduced to a grim reality. His days in prison were marked by deep reflection, but it was too late for redemption. The love he had lost, the family he had destroyed, and the woman he had killed, these were his burdens to carry, and he knew there was no way to undo what had been done. In his final moments of clarity, Lucas understood that no amount of time could ever absolve him of his sins. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and he was forced to live with the knowledge that his actions had irrevocably shattered everything he held dear. As for Eva, the road to redemption was long and filled with pain. The affair that had seemed like an escape, the forbidden bond that had given her a sense of closeness she had never felt before, had ultimately destroyed her. It had led her down a path of deception, manipulation, and betrayal. She had lost her marriage, her family, and, most tragically, herself. Though she tried to move forward, the memories of what she had done, the guilt, the shame, followed her wherever she went. Eva moved to a new city, hoping that the physical distance from Crestwood would offer her a fresh start. But no matter where she went, the lessons of the past remained with her, a constant reminder of how fragile trust and loyalty truly are. In the quiet moments, when the noise of her new life subsided, Eva couldn't help but wonder what could have been. Would she have ever made different choices? Could she have stopped the affair before it spiraled out of control? The answers would remain elusive, buried beneath the weight of her own remorse. And then there was Rachel Foster, the detective whose sharp instincts had uncovered the truth. For her, this case would be one she would never forget. The Westbrook tragedy wasn't just a case of murder, it was a study in human frailty, in the dark recesses of the heart where love, guilt, and revenge could intertwine and destroy lives. Rachel couldn't help but reflect on the lessons this case taught her, how easily a family's foundation could be eroded by secrets, how even the deepest bonds could be shattered by betrayal. She had seen too many tragedies in her career, but the Westbrook case stood out because it wasn't just about the crime. It was about the slow unraveling of everything that had been built on lies. It was a reminder that no matter how perfect things might seem on the surface, beneath it all, the truth waits to be uncovered, and when it is, the fallout can be devastating. As she closed the case files and placed them in the archive, Rachel wondered if there was any way to prevent this kind of destruction. Could a family, a marriage, a bond ever truly recover from the weight of such betrayal? As for Crestwood, life eventually moved on. People would pass through the town, unaware of the darkness that had once lurked behind its peaceful facade. The Westbrook family's story would become just another tale, one whispered about in hushed tones, a cautionary reminder about the dangers of secrets and betrayal. But the tragedy of the Westbrooks would never truly fade away. It would linger, a shadow in the background of their lives, a ghost that could never be exorcised. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that betrayal can truly destroy a family forever, or do you think there's hope for redemption after such a tragedy? Would you ever consider forgiving someone who had hurt you in this way? Let us know in the comments below, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories.